Hello, my name is Dr. Nathaniel Tobias Coleman, and this is an interview for Cast in Stone. And I'm joined by, would you please introduce yourself by name, your profession, and any associations or any groups with which you're associated that are relevant to this interview?
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Caine Lewin Turner. At the moment, I am a PhD student in history and cultural studies. My university affiliation is University of Oxford Magdalen College. I have worked with Bristol Museums, Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, as an internal belligerent force, is how I put it. But I essentially have been working in the heritage world, usually independently, and bring that energy to various activist organizations and sometimes institutions. But in terms of the relevant organizations, at the moment, I would say it's primarily myself rather than an organization that I'm working with.
Thank you very much for joining us, Teo. The purpose of our interview is to have a discussion about your perspective on the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. Would you please tell me how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston? What brought it to your attention?
So I began my investigation into history through my own ignorance, to my own lived experience, how we got here. Essentially, I have family from Ghana and Jamaica, none known in Ghana, but most of them known in Jamaica. I grew up in a British Caribbean household, and I had no idea at quite a late age as to how all of my family spoke the same language, despite being from 3 different continents. So the history of the British Empire, history of enslavement, of hierarchy, was how I kind of addressed all of those things and wanted other people to know similar things. And so history became the way of comprehending the present, also addressing it. That's what brought me to a history degree at the University of West of England, which was concluded at the University of Bristol. Bristol is an incredibly segregated, hostile space, as well as being a beautiful, loving, caring space. I had been interested in how the public was engaged in this process of cultivated ignorance, how the museums, statues, the built environment lent itself to a certain narrative of Britishness, of whiteness, and of belonging. Colston seemed to me to be just a part of a bigger story, and a big thrust of my argument, which didn't age particularly well when I got to Bristol, was that Colston has to be considered as one piece of a big overlapping kind of jigsaw that made up Bristol's public memory and cultivated history. It became particularly present when I knew about it, but it's one of those weird things that just happens to you in this kind of space. I think they were an A-level student who was doing a media studies type course, asked me to talk to them about racism in Bristol, and they were filming it. And as we were filming it, it was on the street, and someone out of a car shouted the N-word whilst we were filming. So we were filming on the street. I can't remember the street it was on now. And it was this weird thing where we both acknowledged it. It was a black student as well doing the filming, and it was this weird thing because we had it on tape. We didn't really know what to do about it, and it was upsetting. It was frustrating. It was all of the things. But I remember that day having to walk past the Colston statue to get home, to get a bus. I got a bus from just past the statue. This is 2000. Must be 2018. I remember it being more poignant, more present to me, every feature of the statue that day when I had just been called the N-word and I had to walk past it. The fact it was standing over me, the fact it was higher than me, like I was being looked down on, was more present that day when I experienced the pretty, because a lot, not I've been called the N word loads many times, but it's when the fact it was caught on tape, the fact that someone else saw it, it wasn't just in my head. I wasn't, as you often feel, I wasn't just kind of exaggerating something that was in the past. I knew it was there, and to me, it became so prominent then, and that's when I started. I still believe that it had to be put into context of how slavery enveloped everything. How Bristol as a city was, of course, it was a second city before, as a lot of historians will tell you. How everything from rope to chocolate to sugar, the obvious examples, was informed by the persecution, enslavement of many. So that to me was the starting point, and it developed into a more robust understanding afterwards of how and why this is important.
I'm very sorry that you were required to navigate that full experience, but thank you for sharing it with us. Just before we move on to the next question, you said that you arrived at Bristol with an idea that didn't age very well. Could you elaborate on that a little more?
I thought that the focus on Colston distracted from the point of what we were trying to get at, which was that the history of enslavement was central to the history of Bristol. And I thought, as this argument around Colston was beneficial to the to certain forces, which were aligned with that kind of cultivation of ignorance, which is, once you got rid of the statue, let's debate the statue, and then we've resolved this matter. And myself and a lot of people were saying, what about the universities? What about the pubs? What about the actual the Georgian houses, but the architecture, the lifestyle and the culture that hasn't died, which has developed into what is now, as I said, what the Runnymede finds to be one of the most segregated areas in Europe. And so it was, to me, a very liberal way of dealing with an issue without actually addressing its totality. It was I thought the attention to Colston was a way of, as I said, certain forces identifying something that could be fixed quite easily. And I always thought it obscured, as I've written about, what was meant to be the most accessible way of saying that Bristol's entire history of the modern history is engulfed with hierarchy. I thought it's obscured more than it revealed. I never imagined there to be the moment of 2020 where it being pulled down by whoever was doing the pulling. I never expected the kind of discussion which followed. And that's why I think and I also think it's really important for people who want to do intellectual work to recognize where they were wrong. And I don't think I was wrong for the wrong reasons. I think I was wrong for the right reasons. As in, I never predicted the moment which no one predicted, which was the kind of energy, the kind of action. Because it wasn't just Colston being pulled down. If Colston got pulled down outside the context of a massive conversation, societal conversation around death, around hierarchy, around Black lives, it wouldn't have produced the kind of outcome that it did. But because it happened in that context, I was wrong to suggest that attending to this one statue in this kind of way would lead to what it did. And so that's why I say the argument didn't age well, even though I still maintain that the tenets of said argument, that we need to have a holistic kind of focus on white supremacy in the built environment, I still maintain is true.
It may have been, this is just a speculation, that the movements to do something about the statue prior to 2020, I'm not sure whether they were movements to topple the statue, were contextually different from the movement to topple the statue in 2020.
Yeah, yeah.
We've talked about that movement and that toppling. So the statue was toppled during a Black Lives Matter movement protest. What, to your knowledge, or from your perspective, have been the Black voices that have been raised in contestation of the statue of Edward Colston? What have those, either in 2020 or before, what have those Black voices been saying?
So I think from my kind of just conversations in Bristol, this is not kind of people who would consider themselves to be doing intellectual work, but I would say that they are. A lot of people who were living in Eastern St Paul's saw it as an issue that was secondary to the material reality of living in Eastern St Paul's. It was never really at the forefront of a lot of people's lives who were struggling on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. That changed, I believe, when there was a consciousness raising that it signified a great deal more than purely a relic to white supremacy, and that also it was at the nerve center of the hierarchy which allowed that to happen. So I think that there were people who were trying to connect those dots early on, and there were also voices who were saying, I care about how infrequently my bins are changed. I care about this quality of schools, and I think that there were people like myself who were trying to connect those dots and didn't always succeed. I think there were also white liberals who, and this is not the question you asked, but it's relevant. The white liberals who saw it as a kind of stain on their city's legacy. And I think that because of the strength of white liberals' voices, that became the message. The message was, let's get rid of this so we can start celebrating how great Bristol is. And I think because that was the mainstream message from within heritage institutions, it alienated the Black voices who were willing to connect the dots between cultivated public memory, which discounted a certain or which promoted certain notions of humanity and subhumanity and day-to-day material lived experience. When I would go to more public spaces, I wish I remember this person's name, but it was an older guy, and I hope he's still around. And he was one of the few people who I found complete agreement with, as in and we can get onto this later, but we desired that Colston was dethroned in the sense that the plinth was removed, and that he was face to face with everyone, and we could confront his sins, confront his legacy, confront the kind of relevance through being not lower than him. And it was an older Black guy who was writing. He had a website, and I will do everything I can to find this website. But he was writing about slavery in Bristol, its relevance, and also how he thought best to deal with issues like Colston. And he was an older guy. I hope that he's still with us. But I imagine that him, like myself, never thought the best case scenario was the city's heritage institutions who were themselves culpable for the kind of legacy that we were trying to address, being in control of that narrative. As in, Colston didn't deserve to be in their hands once it was again. And I think that for me, it was the fact that they created the mess and then they got to clean it up clean it up in a way which absolved them of ever really. It's kind of it's the kind of one of the many things that the kind of parables or the stories that Malcolm X would tell about how, if a group of people are, kicking me on the floor and one stops and then he congratulates himself because everyone else is still kicking me, that's not a good person, right? And I think that's what we would feel if me and this older black guy had this conversation again would kind of happen. But the black voices were never unison. There were certain individuals, Pan-Africanists, especially people from the Caribbean community, especially a lot of Ethiopianists who would have more concern about the heritage of slavery than perhaps other non-Pan-Africanist or ethnicity or different ethnicities who were much more concerned with the day-to-day. But it's also important to recognise where Colston was. It was not in Easton. It was not, well, it was near St Paul's, but not in the St Paul's where we're talking about. It was in the city centre, right by the water, and very close to the hill which really divides, in the sense that it's not too far from Clifton. People from Clifton operate in a different who live in Bristol, Clifton, operate in a different world, and so the location is important about who it affected, why it affected them, and how. So it's a long answer.
There's a lot to unpack there, but this is rich. You mentioned the hill which divides, which I think is an interesting metaphor for the plinth, and you talk about dethroning the statue rather than toppling the statue, taking away not the statue from public space, but taking the plinth away. Given that the plinth remains, what is your perspective on the plinth, its purpose, either when there's a statue on it or when there's no statue on it? What does it express in public space, and what is this dethroning that you're thinking of?
So
what would it have been?
Yeah. So I'll start with the dethroning. It's, to me, as I said, Colston looked down on you, and his the wisdom that was bestowed upon him by the nature of the statue, but also the words on the statue, signified a great deal, which made his history all the more telling and painful to accept. I wanted to be able to confront his crimes. I don't think that's not the right word, but his actions without having to look up. There's this kind of, and I've spoken about this before, this kind of, regardless if it's a slaver, if it's a hero, I don't like the idea that I have to kind of strain my neck to address them, and what that means as an action, to me, has some weight when we consider, the formation of new heritage monuments, but also how we deal with them.
What does that mean as an action?
It's one you become. I don't think that it's always meant to inform, but it's meant to be that someone is, especially the kind of social status we put on height in our society, and the childlike reality of looking up to someone and asking them questions, and for me it's meant to signify strength, but also of the individual, but also a kind of your own weakness in comparison. There is something also kind of that's semi-religious about it, in my mind, in terms of how you're meant to relate to this kind of person who is who I think it doesn't, and this is more not controversial, but it doesn't matter to me if it's Martin Luther King, if it's someone who I respect more than Martin Luther King, if it's an evil, reprehensible individual. It's the fact that they are positioned as higher than me. if a monument does so, it's also, I think, reflecting on it this kind of notion of what it means to be a notable person. How do you elevate a community? It doesn't work in the same way. It's a very individualistic thing where there are, and it's interesting when we talk about the defensive hierarchy that Edmund Burke is a stone throw away, someone whose entire kind of thought it's about the preservation of hierarchy. In many ways, and obviously you know, get into his opposition to French Revolution, but it wasn't any lofty ideas. It was that the hierarchy is being dismantled, and so I've always wanted heritage to reflect a kind of whether it's an I and I consciousness from a Rasta perspective, but something which recognizes that what's great about this person is also great about me. Therefore, how are they higher than me? It's something about the not equality in an abstract sense, but the fact that their great achievements, whoever it was about their humanity, not about them elevating themselves to be higher than other people. So that's about the dethroning. In a more specific context, it was the fact that I was doing all of those things to someone who was central to enslavement, and I think that I thought any kind of confrontation with the heritage and legacies of enslavement required us to be on level playing fields. And this all sounds very lofty and very like, oh, you're not gonna. To me, it's material. What does that man look like when you are face to face with him? What kind of respect you have for his actions, be it the donations, which went in a very specific direction, not throughout society, as people suggest, high Anglican, Tory, informed donations, not let's benefit society. What does his enslavement look like when you're face to face? So it's a mixture of what I think heritage should be doing, which is not elevating some people over others, but also how we confront crimes. Not crimes. I mean the actions which we now know to have caused a great deal of harm in our current society, but also equally as importantly, the actions which was destructive to lives, to societies, to communities, to culture.
Thank you. You mentioned another statue in proximity to the statue of Edward Colston. That's the statue of Edmund Burke. What, if any, relationship is there or has there been between the statue of Edward Colston and the statue of Edmund Burke?
I remember being at so I was at the protest and I'm not saying this because I'm worried about any kind of legal issue. I'm saying this to be honest. I was not involved in any of the planning or any of the action which led to the topple, but I was there, and it was. I remember messaging you, and I remember you responding with something along the lines of pride. What is it? Pride comes before a fall, something like that. Something wise, wise and witty as usual. And for me, it was. I remember being around the statues, and there were so many people. That you couldn't see Colston from where Edmund Burke was, which was odd. And I remember people shouting things at Edmund Burke, and I was thinking as someone who just completed or was completing their undergrad dissertation, think that's not the right statue. That's not the right statue. You're not angry at the right man. From continuing my studies outside of formal education and as well as within, I think that they were, even if they didn't know who that was, they were right to be angry. They were right to flip him off as well as stamp on their head of Colston. I mean, I'm not the intellectual history I do hasn't extended much to Edmund Burke's work, but a lot of people will say he was anti-slavery. He was a gradualist. From what I can find, which was another way of expressing white supremacy, and I think your work around your work, Catherine Hall's work, there's a whole body of work which demonstrates that abolitionist thought was not exclusively, far from exclusively anti-racist thought or pro-black thought. The gradualism of a Burkean kind was a way of reimagining hierarchy, which was what happened and what worked. And when you think about it in the context of decline of, not going to get, Eric Williams' thesis is the numbers aren't perfect, but in terms of a declining system, it was kind of a brilliant way of reimagining hierarchy when it gets down to how could slavery have survived the 19th century. So his abolitionism, if you want to call it, gradualism, was white supremacy, was white supremacist in its manifestation, but also his conservatism. And he was an MP for Bristol. That's why he was. I think that's why he was. I think that's right. I think he's an MP for Bristol, or was based in Bristol for some of his political career. His defense of hierarchy is at the core of his thought, as I said, and I believe that there's an intellectual marriage between the two, and I don't know if they were cultivated in this way in terms of, because I think the statues are quite distinct in terms of when they were erected, but how they matured, because you mentioned about the lifespan of it, and I like this idea, and I think it's the best way to address it. As they matured into the 21st century, these two statues, one signified hierarchy and one defended it. And that to me, that's their relationship. It's also the fact that as I used to, when I was more concerned about diversity than I was of content, it was the fact that there were virtually no statues of people of African Caribbean descent in Bristol, and so they both made up the kind of dominant force of there was more mythical creatures depicted, which is if you go from Colston to the river to the harbour, the third statue along is some kind of mythical man and so their relationship is being the norm, even though one of them's not real. And now it's interesting that Alfred Fagan is now considered to be a statue. The statue which was until very recently was a bust. Everyone just said it was a bust. But they've reclaimed it to be a statue, which is interesting for statistics that they want to have. But that their relationship is to form what we expect to see when we see heritage, the built environment.
What have you been trying to do in relation to the statue? What groups or organizations or associations have you created or been associated with? What is or was your ultimate goal?
So I never was involved in countering Colston, aside from being friendly to people involved and having conversations, being at events with them. I primarily as I mentioned before, operated as an individual. My work with Bristol Museums was part of a kind of black caucus that they basically paid. They paid us to basically as consultants. We would have a meeting every now and then where they would kind of consult us on what we thought about an issue, and which was actually it was more cathartic than anything else in terms of productive, as in we just told them exactly what we thought about them and what they were doing wrong. But and in that there was never really any, I would say, considerable action from that group that which was disbanded when they just stopped caring about these things when the 2020, it was pre-2020, but as soon as that kind of died off in an institutional way, they got rid of us. And I was mainly working. I would do events, everything from events at the University of Bristol, addressing this UE, more community-based stuff. But I always kind of operated as because I was in some ways an interloper, I never wanted to be at the forefront of anything community based. I just supported. I did a lot of work with Madge Dresser, Professor Madge Dresser, who for me was a mentor in these histories, but and also generally. And what she offered me in terms of how to help was she took me on a tour, a kind of a slavery tour of Bristol, which I then started replicating and doing by myself. And so I offered tours to people, sometimes students. I also did it for kind of journalists as well. And so people who were doing regular work on Bristol kind of politics, and I would offer them that service, which I did a couple of times. But yeah, when it comes to organizations, it was more my engagement with them, and it was normally minimal, just speaking up on panels. But what I was trying to achieve was never, which is something I look back on that I wouldn't change, but in the future I would do differently. The momentum was never considered to be movement building. It was consciousness raising, which I still hold dear to my heart, and which is the thrust of the work I do now and will be forever. But I never, like I said, I never saw it as being able to catapult the issues of racism, hierarchy to the forefront of society. And perhaps if we could have capitalized on that if we were trying to build a movement rather than purely change people's minds or change institutional minds, if that makes sense.
You mention your work with Bristol museums. The M Shed received the statue of Edward Colston that was fished out of the water, and after an interval displayed it temporarily as part of a temporary display. What, given your experience with Bristol museums and your thoughts about museums in general, and what, if you saw this particular display, are your opinions on that display?
Yeah, it was from my perspective, it was ethically the wrong thing to do, to not so much to fish it out, but to offer it to the services which allowed its narrative to stay stagnant for so long. I went to the exhibition and found its attempts at neutrality not offensive, but predictable. I thought it reflected the cowardice which led to the requirement to topple it in the first place. I think that what's important for me, and what's important for the legacy of Colston, is that the biggest players when it comes to the council, when it comes to local politics, were all black people who didn't like the statue. That's at least what they said. Marvin Rees, Asher Craig, who was brilliant, the Lord Mayor, oh God, what's Lord Mayor's name?
Cleo Lake.
Cleo Lake. Some of the biggest players in Bristol's local politics were black when this was happening. Some of the most, not all of them, because the Society of Merchant Venturers had some big time historians. Some of the biggest public historians were people who were sympathetic to the history of enslavement. I've mentioned Mads Dresser already. What was happening it's important to note that what was happening when Colston got pulled down and institutionally was that they were debating the wording of the plaque that was going to go on the statue. That was the momentum coming institutionally, despite the kind of what you would assume to be the kind of action taken when you have people of African Caribbean descent in charge in some ways. If you think that politics are how you are in charge, You have public historians who are willing to stake their careers on certain perspectives on Edward Colston and the history of slavery. To me, this all signifies that one, diversity, as in the context of pigmentation, means nothing when confronting power, and that we had to look beyond these and things, the same institutions which caused the issue, to combat it in any type of way. And so when my feeling when going around the exhibition, when kind of coming to terms with the fact that Bristol now owns the statue again, that they reclaimed it, was anarchic. Is the like they were the desire to dethrone the power that they hold. It was not about let's vote in the next great mayor, Lord Mayor, whoever. It was not that we need better representation in Bristol politics. It was that the power was the problem, that the preservation of white supremacy in the built environment and everything that it was binding together was stronger than the good people who were combating it through the institutions. So for me, it was a confirmation of a crystallization. This is more personal. Crystallization of a set of politics which were themselves anti-state, anti-institutions, anti-bureaucracy, and seeking to undermine, comprehend, and destroy hierarchy wherever it manifests. And so for me, I'm grateful in some ways, and I hope that other people had similar epiphanies. But ultimately, I believe it to be was, from my perspective, the wrong action for the council, for the government, local government to take to reclaim it, especially when they acknowledged that it was so odd. The amount of things that were said in the weeks leading after that require some kind of micro history. One, the most strange, revealing one was by the a prominent police person. So it was a policeman. I think it was a chief super, whoever, of Bristol. And the interview you can find online. And he, in responding to an interview question saying, "Why did you not intervene?" he said, "Can you imagine the optics?" And paraphrase, "Can you imagine the optics of a set of police officers standing in the way and protecting a statue of a slave trader at a protest about Black Lives Matter?" And I was like, are people not listening to him? It's like someone asked him why didn't he do his job, and he said because it was too obvious. It was as if no one really recognized, well, not no one, very few people recognized from the institutionally what they were doing, and how business as usual, the new normal, what it actually meant. That police officer revealed exactly, one, what the police are doing, which is protecting power, and two, how we made it impossible for them to do that. By staking making our claims based on Black humanity. Two, by addressing sites of power and saying do something. This is what we cultivated. Refuting power. And so when they fished him, cleaned him up, and put him on display, they themselves were reclaiming the power, the slippage of power that that police officer shed some light on.
Thank you. As well as establishing a display in the M Shed, Bristol City Council created a survey and surveyed the population of Bristol and people outside of Bristol, and produced a report. They did this through the We Are Bristol History Commission. What do you know of the We Are Bristol History Commission, and what do you know of its survey or its report? Did you, for instance, participate in its survey or read its report?
No, I think this is so I remember the report, but for the life of me, it's all gone now. But I remember the survey going out. I think I'll explain my lack of participation rather because the details of it have gone. So there's Colston Hall, as you know, was in a long process of being renamed, being the name being disputed is a better way of putting it. When they put out a survey about what should we rename the Colston Hall, the most popular the most popular answer was Colston Hall. And I thought it was this kind of again a great deal of it's a manipulation of the notion of democracy, which was cowardly, but also did very little to bring people together. Whenever something's called like We Are it's just like it's so obvious that like well it is almost like, okay, we want to make this easier for ourselves, and if you're thinking more critical, division serves them more than solidarity and community, as in the people who are trying to control power. And it's not conspiratorial, it's just that who are the council really invested in the council, local government more broadly, people involved in these politics. They benefit more from a conflicted, battling Bristol community than they do a community kind of operating on consensus, solidarity building, autonomous notions of society. And so, as I said, that crystallizing moment earlier kind of mandated a kind of lack of engagement with these kind of gimmicks in my mind. I also thought that a lot of the kind of Joanna Birch Brown had this amazing way of putting it, which was that people in Bristol kind of had a rug, this is in terms of the white populations, or populations racialized as white, kind of had a rug pulled under them in some ways by higher ups that they didn't even know was there, in the sense of they have been kind of told a certain narrative, and now they're being confronted with its reality without any real and this is not because I mean, if they listen to black communities, it'd be different. That's why this is not an emancipatory kind of statement on their behalf in terms of their kind of more reactionary views. But it was almost as if what a lot of people who were, especially those economically, socially deprived, had very little to cling on to, and so these certain notions of Bristol were a big deal. And so by just putting out a survey saying, what do you feel about this, not readjusting your institutions heritage work so that there is a greater knowledge about what this actually means, not investing in counter narratives in terms of heritage, and not kind of championing historians and histories of enslavement, and just kind of putting out these surveys. All you're doing is sowing discontent amongst usually working people, and that was my decision to not engage. I do remember reading it, but it was so much was happening that year that I couldn't tell you much about it now.
Thank you. One other group or organization I'd like to mention and ask you about, the Legacy Steering Group. perhaps now known as the Bristol Legacy Group. What do you recall of that, or the project that it embarked upon, and the report that it produced, Project Truth?
So was this if you don't mind me asking, was this the group that had like Madge, and but also kind of representatives of the merchant? Um,
I don't believe the merchant venturers were on it. It was, but I might be wrong. It was established by Deputy Mayor Asher Craig.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, and so no involvement personally. I remember through conversations with people like who I won't actually no, I won't mention his name, just haven't checked with him, but individuals who I knew, prominent public historians, some of which I named already, remembering it as a kind of a fraught space in a sense, in terms of coming to terms with, even when the facts are agreed upon, who I mean, the people, when you get to the point where no, it wasn't this many enslaved Africans, it was that many, I think you're missing the point. It wasn't that kind of. It was more about how this history manifests in the public. I remember there being fraught conversations around that, but I don't have strong memories of it. I remember attempting to work around it. I saw it as the kind of I thought anything about. I think Ash Craig was real. Like whenever I would speak to her, it was lovely to me, and I thought that she was doing good work. But my engagement with Bristol museums, for example, was on the basis that I was an external voice. That I that was as institutional as I was willing to be for an issue like this. Uh,
Mhm.
I think I found myself in an awkward kind of dance between the people who had the equipment to pull him down, and the kind of council voices. I never really found myself, not for political, not for like, oh, that's too left, that's too right. It was more about what did I think was best for um, Black lived experience in Bristol, and I actually didn't find either of those camps in terms of let's pull it down right away, let's have an attempt steering group about truth, whatever. I didn't find either to be particularly concerned with Black lived experience, which was my chief concern, if that makes sense.
Mhm. And this now is my final question for you. If there are things you'd like to put on the record that my questions haven't enabled you to do so, please do mention them at this juncture. But my final question relates to Black experience, or rather Black voices. We spoke earlier on about Black voices raised both in 2020 and in the past, in Bristol or across the world, in contestation of this statue, or the of that, in which context this statue sits or stands. To what extent, in your opinion, have those Black voices been listened to?
Um, it depends. I mean, by whom, in a sense of like, you know, who should be doing the listening. And I think for me, I care, as I think it's clear now, I care less about what the institutions, their desire or ability to hear us, but more about how we can cultivate the kind of solidarity community that confronts their power. I think Bristol. So it's more about, are we hearing each other? Is the answer that I would want to give, and I think in some ways, yes. My physical, geographic distance from Bristol makes it a hard question, even harder question to answer in recent years. Um, And so what I'd want to focus on at this point is that we know what's happening to those voices and their ability to hear each other, to create solidarity. I mean, I am all of my friends, and it's not representative of the entirety of Black Bristol, or Black people in the UK. It's of some. All of my friends from Bristol, who I hold dear to my heart, who are proper Bristolians, they are making plans to leave. The ones who are based in Easton, who have the means to leave, are leaving because Easton is becoming Hackney. Easton is getting gentrified, and it's this is something that might not be palatable to some people who don't understand what this means. But the friends talking to me, I grew up in a completely Black area. I grew up in an area where I felt safe, even though it wasn't safe. There was a certain type of person racialized as white you saw, but not, students, right? Like not a vast majority of students who didn't have much care for the local area. Not people who saw it as, I can go to all the good clubs, I can go to my D&B rave and live affordably in Bristol. What people created in these areas, and this goes for Easton, but it goes for these Black, they created a way to live in environments that were hostile to that desire, and that's been disrupted by the influx of predominantly white affluent people. So any solidarity that we built is being undermined by that white presence, I believe, in its current manifestation. My anti-gentrification politics don't go along racialized lines. They go on their ability to disrupt the kind of communities that have been built. Like I use the example of Hackney. I spoke to a Nigerian guy in his 40s, late 40s, early 50s, maybe in Hackney, whose parents moved there from Nigeria, and he's been there his whole life. And he says, I feel like a stranger now. And this is the reality of. And a friend of mine from Easton is moving to Nottingham. Another friend is from just about outside of Easton is planning to move to the Caribbean when it's or to somewhere in Africa when that's financially viable. I think this is the question now for me, and I'm sorry I've gone far, but I hope it's still in line in some ways. The question is now is where are we going to go? There's going to be a consequence of being pushed, and if that consequence is dispersal, that's a worrying thing. Because a lot of, as much as our online platforms are not secure and not safe, that we built, and a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of important black feminist claims about what Twitter offered that are being rejected when people like me talk about how evil these corporations are, blah, blah, blah. It's not as simple as the master's tools. It's more complex than that. However, we know they can be manipulated. They can be taken away from us. And so if we're losing the online spaces that have been so important, especially to ultra marginalized communities, and we're being dispersed, what's the outcome of that? It means that even if we have spent years building up community solidarity, it's going to be increasingly more difficult to build on that, for that to manifest into action. And one thing I want to say in terms of outcomes, who's being heard, I said, and this is my voice is far from the most important here. I said when Bristol, in Bristol, when Colston was pulled down by predominantly white. I don't know about the organising of it, but by predominantly people racialized as white. I said I hope the same people are willing to fight with us when the inevitable backlash happens. Now you remember, I remember, because it's hard to forget the immediate outcome of that, but a lot of this is lost. The gravestone which if all the people who said they care about the fact that Edward Colston was grade 2 listed, I think it was grade 2 listed. No, the gravestone of the enslaved boy Scipio Africanus was split almost in half, defaced, and someone wrote in chalk on the ground, put Colston back up, or things will really heat up. The bust, because there is a bust of Alfred Fagin, was someone threw some kind of corrosive. It was initially said as something bleach-like on it, but more importantly, a local MC and NHS worker was assaulted, like in a dangerous way, which was scary for local Bristolians. But I thought the injuries, off the top of my head, I can't remember if they were life changing, but if you look at the pictures, they look like they could have been. So it was just a young man coming home from work who was attacked. That was in the immediate, kind of in the aftermath. I don't think the people racialized as white who are willing to topple a statue, not those individuals, but the people who would support such a thing, are also willing to stand with us when the inevitable fight back comes. And that's what worries me, because I and other people express concern that you don't know what you've started in a sense. Because of that, I fear that the consciousness between the people who are affected by things and the consciousness between people who care about things are not yet synced up, and that's predominantly because in my mind, activists, radical activists, racialized as white, and this guy, and I hope this comes across clearly what I mean by this. This is regardless of gender, sexuality. I mean, I've organised with white people from a range of backgrounds. I found them all to almost exclusively to be dismissive in certain ways. For them to not look to take charge, but to listen when dealing with anti-racism, but to be an ally in a way which actually preserves dignity, humanity, and safety of the black people, the brown people who they claim to be to care so much about. And that's especially true for anti-racist movements, but I think even more true for the kind of broad coalitions which are trying to fight stuff like for community spaces, for climate change, or that to me is a paramount issue that I still feel is like a gap. And so when you ask me, are they being listened to? I don't care if Bristol Museums. I know the answer to that is no. I don't care. I want to know about the kind of solidarity and community, and that's where I still have worries, quite grave concerns. But the optimism is still there. That solidarity, without it being dangerous, without it being hierarchical, without it being informed by all the things that we're fighting against, is possible. And I am genuinely hopeful, and feel like one of the ways I'm hopeful, or one of the reasons I'm hopeful, is because of projects like this. Even when they have an institutional bend, even when they are informed by educational practice I don't always agree with, that we are trying to figure out what happened, how to do it again, how to do it better. So thank you for letting me talk all this nonsense.
Caine Teo, Lewin Turner, thank you for sharing with us your perspective on the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I cannot express how, I just called it nonsense, but I cannot express how important this is. We have connected the dots. We know what we're fighting for. We just need to be absolutely clear on why this is important, and I believe that's what you're doing, and your, and that's not saying this because it's recorded, but your broader work speaks to these principles, and I'm incredibly grateful for it and for letting me inform any of that. So thank you.
Would you please tell me about the statue that was placed upon the empty plinth of Edward Colston?
So yeah, the empty plinth. What for me, there's a certain part of me which believes that there is a sense of a kind of power vacuum. The fact that plinth is still there, the ability for someone to be higher than someone else, someone to be looked up at, is there. That capacity is still there, and there are a lot of politics about the erection of the statue of Jen Reid, the temporary statue of Jen Reid, by a white male artist who was kind of a bit abstract, divorced from the situation, and the fact that that was put on there from outside. I think it's a lot going on. It's fraught. But the fact that Marvin Reeves and other people have said this, other local Bristolians, Lawrence Hu has for example, has noted this, but how quick they were to remove that statue of a black woman when the issues around Colston, which of course was grade listed and had stakeholders, blah blah blah. That was a protracted process that would have gone on had gone on for years and would have gone on for years, but they were quick and decisive. The presence of a black woman on that pedestal, on that plinth, that to me is in many ways indicative of what that kind of hierarchical feature of heritage represents, who it serves, and also why we have to be, in my mind, dismissive of people who utilize black lived experience for their own political careers, but then act in ways which are at odds to respect and dignity which that lived experience's space in the public realm should inform. So for me, the speed at which that statue was removed, even if that was the right decision, is quite telling.
Thank you, Teo.